In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy. The city of Stalingrad sat on the Volga River in southern Russia. It was an industrial center, a transport hub, and a symbolic prize. A city bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself. Hitler wanted it. Not because taking it would win the war, but because losing it, he believed, would break the Soviet will to fight. What followed was the largest, bloodiest, most savage urban battle in the history of human warfare. Two armies, two dictators, and one city that neither man could afford to lose. By the time it was over, nearly 2 million people were dead, and the course of the Second World War had changed forever. If you enjoyed this, a subscribe, bell notification, or comment means the world. It helps the channel grow and keeps me digging up more stories for you. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's war in the East was not going as planned. The Soviet Union had not collapsed as promised. The Red Army had not broken. The winter of 1941 had come within a day of destroying his forces outside Moscow. Hitler needed something to show his generals, his people, and himself. Proof that the campaign could still be won. He split his southern forces in two. One thrust would go for the Caucasus oil fields. The other, the Sixth Army, 300,000 men under General Friedrich Paulus, the most powerful ground force Germany had ever assembled, would go for Stalingrad. But there was something different about this order. The city had not been chosen for strategic reasons. It had been chosen for its name. A city called Stalingrad could not be left standing. For Hitler, taking it had become personal. That decision would cost him the war. The German advance on Stalingrad began with fire from the sky. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the heaviest aerial bombardments of the entire war against the city. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single day. The city was reduced to rubble. And then the Sixth Army entered it. What they found was not what they expected. The rubble was not an obstacle, it was a weapon, and the defenders knew how to use it. The Red Army had prepared for exactly this kind of fighting. Every ruin became a fortress. Every factory became a battlefield. The broad open avenues that German tanks had rolled across easily in France and in the open steppe became death traps in the narrow streets of a burning city. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army inside Stalingrad, understood one thing above all else. The closer his men stayed to the Germans, the less the German artillery and air power could be used. His strategy was brutal and simple. Hug them. Stay so close that killing them means killing yourself. What followed became known as Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. German soldiers who had marched across Europe in months now fought for weeks over single buildings. The grain elevator, a massive concrete silo in the south of the city, changed hands more than a dozen times. The Red October factory, the Barricade gun plant, the tractor factory, each one became its own private war within the war. Men fought in basements, on staircases, through holes blasted in walls between rooms. Snipers became the defining figures of Stalingrad. Soviet marksman Vasily Zaitsev killed more than 200 German soldiers from the ruins, becoming a symbol of resistance the entire Soviet Union rallied around. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving as a reinforcement in Stalingrad was 24 hours. The average life expectancy of a Soviet lieutenant was 3 days. And still, they came. By November 1942, the Germans had pushed Chuikov's defenders to a strip of ground along the Volga's western bank, barely 200 meters deep in places. 200 meters. That was all that remained of Soviet Stalingrad. The Volga behind them was beginning to freeze, too thin to cross on foot, too thick for the supply boats that had been running the German gauntlet all autumn. In Moscow, Stalin's order was simple and absolute. There is no land beyond the Volga, not one step back. Chuikov read that order to his men. They already knew. They were fighting over rubble in a city that barely existed anymore. And on the open steppe outside the city, in the vast frozen space that Paulus could see from his headquarters but had stopped thinking about because nothing had come from it in months, Georgy Zhukov was finishing his preparations for something Paulus would not see coming until it was already too late. At 5 in the morning on November 19, 1942, over 3,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire at once on the German positions north of Stalingrad. The noise was heard hundreds of miles away. Operation Uranus, planned in complete secrecy while the battle inside the city consumed everyone's attention, had begun. The flanks of the German salient around Stalingrad were held not by German soldiers, but by Romanian and Italian armies, Allied forces with lighter weapons, older equipment, and no belief in a cause worth dying for. They broke within hours. The Soviet armored columns drove south through the gap, moving faster than their own commanders had planned. The next day, a second Soviet force struck from the south. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the guns opened fire, the two pincers met at Kalach on the Don. The Sixth Army was encircled. 300,000 German soldiers, the finest force Germany had, were trapped inside a shrinking pocket on the frozen Russian steppe. And Friedrich Paulus, looking at his maps, understood for the first time what had been happening while his army was fighting over factories. What followed inside the Kessel, the cauldron as the surrounded Germans called it, was a slow death in the cold. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He promised instead that the Luftwaffe would supply the surrounded army from the air. It was a promise the Luftwaffe could never keep. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies per day to survive and fight. The air bridge delivered an average of 90. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The horses were eaten first, then the dogs, then anything that moved. A relief force under Field Marshal Manstein drove toward the pocket from the south and came within 40 miles before being stopped. Hitler still refused to allow Paulus to break out toward it. The window closed. The relief force withdrew. And the men inside the Kessel waited for the end they could now see coming. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was not a reward. It was a message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was telling Paulus to die. The next day, January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces in the basement of a bombed-out department store in central Stalingrad. He became the first German Field Marshal in history to be taken prisoner. 91,000 survivors of the Sixth Army marched into Soviet captivity. Of those 91,000, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in the camps, in the cold, from hunger and disease, over the years that followed. The Battle of Stalingrad had cost nearly 2 million lives. It broke the myth of German invincibility that had held since 1939. After Stalingrad, every German soldier on the Eastern Front knew, even if they could not say it, that they were no longer winning this war. They were now fighting to survive it.